Welcome to a very special episode of the Truckers Network radio show here on tncradio.live. I'm your host, Shelley Johnson. Michael Martin Murphey is a legend on the music scene with wonderful ballads and hits like Wildfire, Carolina in the Pines, What's Forever For, Geronimo's Cadillac, and Cowboy Logic. He's topped the pop, country, western, and bluegrass charts, and he's known as a purveyor of the music, lifestyle, and values of the American West. Michael is also the honorary chair of the Santa Fe Trail 200 for the Santa Fe Trail Association at santafetrail.org. Michael is with us today, and I'm so excited. Michael, I've been a big fan of yours for years with your songs and wonderful ballads. In addition to your albums, your songs have been recorded by some great artists like Dolly Parton, The Monkees, Kenny Rogers, John Denver, Johnny Cash, Johnny Rivers, Billy Ray Cyrus, and many others. That's just phenomenal. And you have a rich history that you can share with us about the Santa Fe Trail. You've been doing so many things. In addition to being a wonderful musician, you're also a history buff.
Well, I grew up in Texas, and my love of anything that had to do with cowboys was expanded into also a love of anything about Native Americans when my dad took me on a vacation with my little brother and my mom out to Grand Canyon, and I saw Indian dancing for the first time. Then we went to Taos, and I was fascinated with those places. I thought we were just a bunch of hicks raising hay out here in Texas. I didn't realize that we were the real cowboys, and the ones we saw in the movies were the fakes. But it was something that got me into history at a young age. I started buying books about the history of the West when I was probably 11 years old. And I also started collecting whatever I could afford off my allowance when we were on trips. I'd buy Kachina dolls. And when I was in the Cub Scouts, I learned how to make moccasins and do Indian stuff. So I became fascinated with the history of the American West first. I'm interested in all of history now because it all interrelates. You can't understand Western history without understanding European history. You can't understand European history without understanding the history of the Asians. So it's world history, really, that's my interest, with a focus on the American West, which is my backyard.
Did some of this with the trips like you described with your family, did that influence your music?
Yes, tremendously. If you listen closely to my albums, you'll see I set out from the very beginning when I made my first album, which was released in 1972. By the way, that album is still available in the Smithsonian Institution gift shop, I think. I'm kidding. But some of these albums are hard to find now. That album was called Geronimo's Cadillac. I set out from the very beginning to try to be a lyricist, hate to use the high-flown term poet, but a lyricist poet of the American West. That was, and particularly the Southwest, my backyard. My favorite literature, my favorite reading is always the stuff written by authors who actually knew the places where they were. They were using that as a taking off point. Mark Twain, was on those riverboats. He wrote about the South in a way that nobody else could because he lived it. It was his backyard. He wrote about the Mississippi, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, the Great Jumping Frog Contest of Calaveras County. Those are Mark Twain gems. And Twain loved the West, and he actually lived in Virginia City, Nevada for a while. So I like that kind of an author. I like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who wrote a great book called Love in the Time of Cholera, which is very good for anybody who's interested in the impact of something like COVID on society, because it's about the cholera epidemic that happened in South America. And these two lovers can never actually get together in person because of that. And they don't actually get married until they're 90 years old. They get separated when they're young, and they come back together at 90. It's a wonderful story. Marquez, again, is a South American, and he writes about his own backyard, but he does it in a way that it universalizes it and you can understand it. That's my favorite kind of author. So I tried to be one of those authors and pretty much keeping my music about what I see around me in my own backyard, my home, the Southwest.
On a dark flat land she rides, on a pony she named Wildfire. Whirlwind by your side, on a cold Nebraska night.
Oh, they say she died one winter when there came a killing frost, and the pony she named Wildfire busted down his stalk. In a blizzard she was lost.
So by the dark of the moon I played there, but there came an early snow. There's been a hoot owl howling outside my window now, 6 nights in a row. She's coming for me, I know, and on Wildfire we're both gonna go.
We're both gonna go.
We'll be riding Wildfire. We'll be riding Wildfire. We'll be riding Wildfire. On Wildfire we're gonna ride, gonna leave side busting behind. Get the hard times right on out of our minds. We'll be riding Wildfire. We'll be riding Wildfire.
That is a beautiful version of Wildfire with you and Amy Grant. I love it. Your music's so relatable, and you draw people in. There's so much texture and depth, the messaging, everything. You draw in a flavor of the past that I don't think a lot of musicians do. I think that's why people love your music so much.
Well, let me just say that if I were a psychologist, which I'm not, or I were a philosopher without a degree, people are always saying, oh, how boring. You're a history buff. What does history really matter? Well, take the history of anything out of the picture and you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are, and you don't know where you're going.
So true.
History is the essential thing to know. Anytime you sit down and write something out, whether it's in cursive or in block letters, you're engaging in the history of writing.
Yeah.
Those styles were all developed way before you were born by the Phoenicians in Greece. You know, our alphabet comes from their alphabet. Do you need to know that? Well, it helps. I guarantee you, the more historical perspective you have on whatever it is you're doing in your life, including the history of Bill Gates or the history of the guys that developed Apple, you need to know these things to know where you're going and how it affects your life and how you're going to let it affect your life. And that's why when I say I'm a history buff, I think everybody should be a history buff. And if you're not ever going to understand the news. You're not ever going to understand the stock market. You're never going to understand anything. All you're going to do is wake up and say, oh, look at these things around us, trees. I wonder why they look different. Oh, maybe I better look that up. Oh, I'm sorry, there's no history book to tell me what that is.
Sure. I totally agree. Oh, you're preaching to the choir here. I totally agree. And from what I understand, when I talked to Deb Goodrich, you had an interest in ancient history. You have really delved into all kinds of history, in addition to the Santa Fe Trail, which most people don't realize what a tremendous impact that had in the development of this nation as a commercial highway and international highway, and all the people who traveled it.
I like ancient history because I like it. I like history that is about adventure. Mm-hmm. And you can't find a greater adventure than the story of the Santa Fe Trail. This is where every American adventurer and other adventurers from Europe went to go trade on this Santa Fe Trail. And it's really the story of America.
So who were the people who traveled the Santa Fe Trail? I think that putting a face to the history, that's what really draws people in. There were all kinds of people who braved that trail. And you really had to be brave because it was a tough trip.
We celebrate the 200th anniversary of the Santa Fe Trail still this year. 1821 was the year that William Becknell, who was a trader from back in the eastern part of the West, got together some wagons and stuff and went over this trail that he heard about that went to Santa Fe. This trail was already being used by people who wanted to get to Santa Fe and do some trading, mainly by mountain men. But it sort of got its official title when it got surveyed. So the reason we celebrate the 200th in 1821 is because William Becknell's first trip, official trip on the Santa Fe Trail as surveyed by American surveyors, was in 1821. We still celebrate it this year in 2022 because he returned in 1822. So this is 200 years of history we're talking about, and Becknell was quite the amazing guy. If you're a trucker out there listening to this, because this is the Truckers Network, it's significant why they chose the Santa Fe Trail, why they chose that particular route. It had been used for hundreds of years, and it's because it followed and went alongside the Arkansas River. And the Arkansas River was the primary river that you followed until you got down to below Dodge City. And then you went down to about where Trinidad, Colorado is, somewhere around where you go over Raton Pass. And you got to go around Las Vegas, New Mexico area. It wasn't called that then. And then you get to Santa Fe. There was another way you could go, which is to go to Taos, New Mexico. Very much the same way, except you went straight across from Dodge City. By the way, it wasn't called Dodge City then either, but that's where the supplies were stashed at the time. So when Texas became a republic in 1836, if you look at a map of the original Republic of Texas, it included all the territory over to about Dodge City and following the Arkansas River right into its headwaters in Colorado. So Republic of Texas once included Colorado, parts of Kansas, parts of Arkansas, and of course what's parts of what is now New Mexico. They wanted to control all those headwaters. The most important river in the West was the Arkansas, because when you were going across that big open plain where there were no trees, Council Grove, Kansas was the last place you would encounter trees. From there on, it was pretty much a big wide open plain with no trees. So you had to know where the water was. Virtually every great Westerner was on the Santa Fe Trail. Wyatt Earp, Jesse James, and his brother Frank actually went out on the Santa Fe Trail to go to California after the Civil War to nurse Jesse James's wounds from the Civil War. And you can actually see where they signed in on the guest book in Cimarron, New Mexico at the St. James Hotel. You can see Robert Howard, which was Jesse James's alias. He stayed there at that hotel and then went on to California to kind of some hot springs owned by his cousin. You talk about Native Americans, really famous Native Americans were on it. Buffalo Bill was on the Santa Fe Trail at one time. Probably the only one I can think of that I don't think was on it was Billy the Kid. But we really don't know how he got to New Mexico originally. It's possible that when he came from New York with his mother, he went out the Santa Fe Trail and then went south to Silver City. It's really that important. Jedediah Smith, my hero, is a mountain man. I consider to be the greatest mountain man ever. Jedediah Smith was on the Santa Fe Trail, actually died on the Santa Fe Trail cutoff that went down on the dry route of the Cimarron, was attacked by Comancheros there and killed. Jedediah Smith was a guide to a lot of these traders. Now, Becknell knew all these people, and he organized this thing, and it made big news. He never really revealed, though, his exact route when he wrote his journals. He published the story. He never revealed his exact route because that was a trade secret at those times.
Sure.
I am pretty sure that he went to Taos first, Taos, New Mexico, where I used to live, then down along some pretty precipitously dangerous trails that go kind of follow the Rio Grande and then drop down into Santa Fe. That old highway called the Old Taos Highway, by the way, is still a drivable route. And it's beautiful. It's just, and you drive along that route, the old Taos Trail going out of Taos to Santa Fe. There's churches in there built in the 1600s and the 1700s along that route before Becknell ever took that route. So I think that he went that way because there was too much danger from Indian attacks and from marauders and robbers going the other way. But eventually he took the mountain route over Santa Fe, and he is the one who sort of pioneered that route. There were other people that took off around the same time that wanted to be first, but Becknell got there first.
You know, when you think about it, a lot of people are traveling along the Santa Fe Trail and not even realizing it. I took a train years ago from Chicago out to California, and we went by and through Dodge City. So that would have been part of the Santa Fe Trail, right?
Right. And if you think about it, it's part of it is Route 66.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
There were offshoots from the Santa Fe Trail that went down into Texas, and also didn't take what we now think of as the standard route that goes over Raton Pass and down. The one that went straight to Taos, that was one that was pioneered by Louis Grizzard, and he did that on mules and horseback. Becknell, I don't think, even had wagons on that 1821 route. It wasn't until later that they actually sent a lot of wagons. He might have had a few wagons, but those great big Conestoga wagons came in later that could carry a whole lot of freight. Once they figured out what the best route was, then it became the most important overland trail route. Now, here's a little historical fact that'll get all the Eastern truckers out there turned on. The actual push to get this trail going started with Washington and Jefferson in the founding of our country. It was Washington's vision to have a national road. It's what he called the national road. And where he was trying to get on that national road back then was to St. Louis, where he could trade with the people that came up the Mississippi, you know, which is, as we well know, was variously owned by Spain and then France. And so Washington said, we got to get there. So his vision of the national road, which they built part of even back around the time of just after the Declaration of Independence in 1776, you know, was built from Fort Baltimore, right around that area, just kind of straight across, and it went to the Ohio River. And then you could take the Ohio River down and then get on the lower Mississippi and get up to St. Louis that way. And that was his vision of how to get, or you could go overland on something called the Zanes Trace, which ended up in what we now call Vidalia, Illinois. And it just raises the bumps on the back of my neck to think that our founding fathers were the guys who thought of this. You know, Washington in the military was a surveyor. He actually surveyed for the military during the Indian Wars. That's how he got his career started. And Jefferson was also a mathematician and a bit of a surveyor. These guys knew about roads, and they knew the importance of building roads. The fact that they kind of looked at what became the Santa Fe Trail as what would be the national road, at least as far as St. Louis, which is where Becknell took off from, Independence, Missouri. In that area is where most of the people took off from the Santa Fe Trail. To think that this was already a vision of the founding fathers all the way back at the start of our country. By the way, Ben Franklin was involved in this too.
Okay.
See, the very first push west, the very first people that went to what was American Western Territory was Ohio. And Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin had to sign off on the charter that they gave to the guys who wanted to settle in Ohio. Ohio, they didn't know what to do with it. They got it from the British right after the war. They didn't know what to do with it. It was a huge territory that the British had controlled. And it was in the settlement with the British, which, by the way, didn't happen until well after the War of Independence was over. They finally settled on, Washington wouldn't sign the Treaty of Peace with the British, so-called Treaty of Peace. He wouldn't sign that until they gave him Ohio territory, which was called the Old Northwest Territory at that time. Wasn't called Ohio, but the Ohio River went through there.
Mm-hmm.
And he took that first little band of people who were adventurers and gave them a charter to go settle in what is now Marietta, Ohio. So this push west started right then, and going down the Ohio was also the way that Lewis and Clark got up to the Mississippi and then to the Missouri to go on their trip, which didn't happen that long after the founding of our country. We're talking 1812. No, actually earlier than that.
Mm-hmm.
So probably be about 10 years before 1821. Anyway, this is such an important road. And I love that this is a trucking show because I'm kind of an over-the-road trucker too. I've spent my whole life in tour buses, stopping at truck stops all over America, doing my career. And, you know, you just become interested in these routes and why they went that way and why they built them along those routes. It wasn't based on who might attack you along the trail, although they sometimes did offshoots. They followed the rivers. They followed where you could get water, where you could get supplies. You basically see I-80 follows the Oregon Trail. I-70 follows the Santa Fe Trail. It's a little bit north of the Santa Fe Trail and the Smoky Hill Trail. I-25 basically follows the old Chisholm Trail. I-35, I should say. I-25 follows the old Western Trail that went up to Canada when they drove cattle up that way. But this has got a really important component in cowboy history, which is the thing I'm the most interested in, is a history of cowboys and cattle industry. Dodge City, that's where you drove, ultimately became the greatest trail drive city. And it was on the Santa Fe Trail. Here it comes up from Texas, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you had a number of other locations that they eventually moved west of Dodge City because they had a big cattle fever problem in the 1880s that said, you can't bring Texas cattle up here because they've got this Texas fever. So they kept moving it along, but they moved it along what was the railroad. The railroad also followed that. So the Santa Fe Trail is a trading trail with wagons and stuff, ended when they got the first railroads
Right.
that went down to Santa Fe. So it's how we built our highways, it's how we built our railroads, and it's how we determine what cities became really successful cities. And you can still see a lot of locations along the way.
It determined our commerce, no doubt. And I find it very interesting that you said that our forefathers were so forward thinking to have a national highway. People think of Eisenhower. No, it was long before him.
Well, Eisenhower just, where was Eisenhower from? Kansas.
There you go. Hey, I hadn't thought about that. Good point.
And he basically was born right on one of those cattle trails and real close to Route 66 and real close to, which was over more by Independence, Missouri, but very close to the Santa Fe Trail. He was born in Santa Fe Trail country. And I think that's part of why he got that vision. He grew up with that history all around him of Kansas being basically the quintessential Western trade state. People don't think of Kansas, they think it's a Midwestern state, but it was the far West at one time.
Sure.
And that was how you got to the far West, was over that trail. The story of Kansas is really the story of our nation.
Well, when you think about it, it was quite the trip. If you came from the East Coast and headed west, it took months, didn't it?
It did, and it was a very dangerous trip through a lot of that, because you went through a lot of places where there are a lot of hostile Native Americans. There are also friendly Native Americans. The vast majority of Native Americans loved the trading, and they participated in the trading. Sometimes when they got cut out of a deal where they couldn't get their supplies anymore, or people started killing off their buffalo, then they got hostile. But people think of them as being hostile from the very beginning. They really weren't. They loved, Lewis and Clark only had one incident with the Indians, with the Pawnees along the way. And that was over, I think it was Meriwether Lewis's dog ran after a horse that an Indian was on, and got involved in some kind of a conflagration, and the Pawnees got mad. But mostly these Native Americans were really friendly, and they really welcomed this trail, and it was their trail. They're the ones who developed the trail in the first place.
Right.
Then the Spanish developed it. And then when Mexico got its independence from Spain in 1821, that's when it became friendly to Americans. Before that, Spain didn't want the Americans in there. We were illegal immigrants. Whenever we crossed about where Dodge City is, we were on the wrong side of Spain's politically correct attitude about their empire. So yes, you have this feeling of these guys knew what they were doing, and you have to go back to who was controlling all that territory at that time, and then you can see the influences. If you go to Kansas City today and go downtown, you see a lot of Spanish influence in the buildings that were built there over the years. And that's because it was considered part of the Spanish Empire.
Spain really had a stranglehold at that point. Lots of taxation. It was not friendly.
It's absolutely amazing that Spain ever lost all the territory that it controlled. You think about Spain, Portugal, Christopher Columbus. These people were the ones who sailed around the world and found the new world and started the development of it. And again, I know the classic story is, they came in, they killed all the Indians. It is true. There were terrible massacres and horrendous stuff. A lot of that happened later, though. Most of the Native Americans and even the Middle Americans in Mexico were pretty friendly to the Spanish on a trading basis. They were fascinated with these people that brought them all this stuff. But like politics goes, you get different people getting jealous of each other about who gets what and how much gold we get for how much goods that we give you. And pretty soon you got a war going on, just like pretty much what drives most wars is commerce,
Sure.
Yeah, some of it was greed. Some people, once they saw what their resources were, they pulled a gun and they said, This is ours now. You, the rest of you, get out of here.
Sure. Yep.
But that wasn't all just between the white man and the Native Americans. That was also between white man and Latino and white man, and
Sure.
and European groups that had different attitudes. But America's always been a place where people came to be freer and get freer territory, and that's what drives us. I think
Yeah.
we're driven toward freedom. We always want to have some space around us. We always want to own some land,
Yeah.
And that's why our Constitution was written by guys who understood roads, understood bridges, understood trading, and understood that the best thing that the military can do is have forts where people can trade, So a lot of the trading posts were actually built around military posts, but they didn't even become military posts till later. Fort Bridger was just a trading post run by Jim Bridger for a long time. Then there were some military problems between the Mormons and the United States, and so the U.S. came in and took over Fort Bridger later, and put a military post there. But it wasn't really originally a military post. And I actually put out a DVD on that I did with a professor from University of Michigan named Harry Frank. It's called Frontier Forts, and it's a DVD you can get on my website. It's the whole history of all the frontier forts. Again, people overlook the military history. You hardly ever see that in Westerns, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you can't understand the history of the West until you look at the military forts, where they were built and what was going on in those places. And they were basically built to try to protect the trade that was going on those trading trails.
Because commerce is absolutely essential. Totally agree. And that's what our forefathers saw. Like you said, they were very forward thinking. They had an understanding of the big picture, which in many cases today, that isn't always the case. But the Santa Fe Trail was also, although it had maybe some of its downsides, it was a unifier, and it was part of our melting pot, and it really did shape our nation.
Yeah, it was really essential that all Americans at that time stood up and recognized the importance of Mexico allowing us in.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, later on to what happened in Texas and other places, eventually it became U.S. territory. But America was always still open to, other countries and other traders using it. And there were a lot of Germans, a lot of Irish and Scottish. And I just, as a musician, I just want to make this comment. It's my belief and my thesis that Western music, country music, that was the American style country music, actually was developed. Western music is really the country music that came out of Appalachia. A lot of those traders that were on the Santa Fe Trail played those Appalachian fiddle tunes, but people weren't content to just write about what was happening in, the shady groves out in Kentucky and in the hills of North Carolina and stuff. So they changed the words to refer to what was happening out on the plains when they were out there as traders. You trace the history. Jedediah Smith was from New York, right? A lot of those Irish tunes that came out of New York, they were rethought and remade into cowboy songs and early Western songs. And Santa Fe Trail was as much a cattle trail as it was anything else. Not long after it was opened up, it was actually a place you drove cattle over. And it was where you were going when the railroad finally took it over. So I believe that what we call country and Western music was developed by the people that were on those trails, on those wagon trains, because they'd carry a fiddle with them. There really weren't many guitars out there on those trails. They'd have a little squeeze box or a fiddle.
Or harmonica?
Sometimes a harmonica or a hammered dulcimer. Mm-hmm. These were all instruments you could carry in a wagon.
Sure.
Or even on horseback, a little banjo. And that's really where our country and Western music got started. And the reason why some country singers that aren't even from the West still wear cowboy hats is because it was developed by cowboys that were out there on those trails. And Santa Fe Trail was, of course, the essential trail.
Mm-hmm.
I have a song that you're going to play here in a minute. I'll just set this up.
Okay.
Called the Santa Fe Trail. It's an old song written in Utah quite a few years ago, but it's an old folk melody, and it's a really good description of the experience of being on the Santa Fe Trail. But it's also a lot of fun because the song is about a guy who sees a beautiful girl riding a horse out on the Santa Fe Trail, and he spends the rest of his life trying to find her. And, hey, Pard, have you sighted a schooner alongside of the Santa Fe Trail? It had been there a Monday or sooner with a water keg tied to the tail. And then it says, I saw her ride down the arroyo, down by the Arkansas sand, with a smile like an acre of sunflowers and a little brown quart in her hand. She mounted her pony so airy, and she rode like she carried the mail, and her eyes near let fire to the prairie alongside of the Santa Fe Trail. Now that's an Irish melody talking about a Western experience. So
I love it.
About things that happened in the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s. So that's the origin of Western music.
Say, Pard, have you sighted a schooner way out on the Santa Fe Trail? They made it here Monday or sooner with the water keg tied to the tail. There was Daddy and Ma on the mule seat, somewhere along by the way was a tow-headed gal on a pinto, just a jangling for old Santa Fe. Just a jangling for old Santa Fe. I seen her right down the arroyo, way back on the Arkansas sand, with a smile like an acre of sunflowers and a little brown quirt in her hand. She mounted her pony so airy, and she rode like she carried the mail, and her eyes near set fire to the prairie alongside of the Santa Fe Trail. Alongside of the Santa Fe Trail. Oh, I know a gal by the border that I ride to El Paso to sight, and I'm acquainted with the high-flying odor, and I sometimes kiss some gals goodnight. But Lord, they're all ruffles and beaten, and afternoon tea by the pail, compared to the sort of stampede that I got on the Santa Fe Trail. That I got on the Santa Fe Trail. I don't know her name on the prairie. When you're hunting one gal, it's two way. It's shorter from hell to Hilaire than it is on that Santa Fe Road. I'll try to make plumbers by sundown, where a camp can be made in the swale, and I'll come on a gal with a pinto, camp alongside the Santa Fe Trail. Alongside of the Santa Fe Trail. Alongside of the Santa Fe Trail. and her eyes near set fire to the prairie alongside of the Santa Fe train.
I love this. Oh my goodness, you've really put a perspective and shown how one highway had so much impact in so many different places.
And all the highways it was connected to, you know.
Mm-hmm. And it even influenced music. Nobody thinks about that.
So after it got to Santa Fe, what did it connect to there? It connected to what they called the Royal Road. This was a road that went all the way to Mexico City. The capital of the province of New Spain and Mexico, when Mexico had it, the capital was actually Chihuahua. So if you got in trouble in Santa Fe, or you were an illegal trader, if you got rounded up and said, okay, you're here illegally, they sent you to Chihuahua. And let me tell you, most of those people had to walk with leg irons on their feet all the way to Chihuahua.
Wow.
They didn't give them horses or put them in a carriage. You can bet on that. Crossing the desert, can you imagine that as a prisoner in those times?
No.
So you had to have a lot of guts to want to go there at the time when you were an illegal. But yeah, it's the ultimate iron will of a country and the iron will of people trying to make a living. You know, so I salute the truckers out there, because you're still doing exactly what those old traders were doing.
And they consider
taking goods up and down America.
Sorry to interrupt you there. They consider themselves cowboys, you know?
Well, they're certainly wagoneers. They're certainly certainly traders. And yeah, there's a lot of cowboy soul in that, because you're basically rounding up things and driving them to another place.
Yeah. So the tradition.
Sometimes you really are taking cattle.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Bull haulers. You betcha. Yeah. Oh, my goodness. This is marvelous, Michael. I really, really appreciate you putting a face to history. You've really tied it together. You're a great storyteller. Of course, I'm not surprised, because your songs have wonderful stories.
I really miss Route 66. I saw a little bit of 66 as it was in the 50s when I was a kid. And, it became, something else along the way. And eventually, became I-40, But the old original Route 66 had some wonderful stuff along it. Great old diners.
Oh, yeah.
Great old roadhouses where you could stop off and hear some music and hear a Western swing band. When I was a kid, those, of course, places were kind of forbidden because we were Baptists from Texas. We didn't go in those places. But, that's... They had those roadhouses, and then you had the diners along the way that made, I guess probably that's where hamburgers kind of took off as the great American food was. They'd make those hamburgers and those hot dogs in those diners. So I wrote a song that's on my album that's coming out that you can actually pre-order it on my website, just to do a little self-promotion here.
Oh,
it's
sure.
called Blues for 66, and it's really a song about how I miss Route 66. And I wrote it with my son, who was never on Route 66 in those days, but I took him along the old route to some of it that still existed, and he became fascinated with that as a child. So the song mentions a whole lot of the imagery of Route 66 and the towns that it went through. So this is Blues for 66 from the Road Beyond the View album.
Wonderful.
Flowers in the nursery, ram's head floating by, dead roses for Anita, floating mountains in the sky. For Arthur and lavender, a nursery of bones, petals in the desert, a pallet of stones, apples from a broken tree, skulls in the clouds, green simplicity, unspoken doubts, underlined purple chaos, screaming red from above, antlers from eternity, dead letters, broken love. We were beyond the view, far away nearby, chase the red clay moon into the wild-eyed night. Tonight I'm coming home again, from a place I never knew, Black Mesa in a dark wind, on the road beyond the view. Looking for another place, on the road beyond the view. You know, I thought I saw your face, far away and close to you, on a canvas hitting turquoise, in a blue larkspur, in the spaces of emptiness, I hear the messenger. I want to live beyond the politics, red and blue religion too. Walk the desert playing pickup sticks, solving riddles false and true. Cross the Jesus in the sunset, bleeding heart wasteland, in the cliffs beyond Abacu, in a sea of sage and sand. The road beyond the view, far away nearby, chase a red clay moon into the wild-eyed night. Tonight I'm coming home again, from a place I never knew, Black Mesa in a dark wind, on the road beyond the view. Black Mesa in the dark wind, on the road beyond the view.
Your history of the Santa Fe Trail has been just tremendous. I wanted to thank you for that. Where can people find you and all of your music? This is wonderful.
Well, I'll just say you can find me on my website, michaelmartinmurphey.com. There's a store where you can order the music I've talked about, and the album that Road Beyond the View is on. It's called Road Beyond the View, and there's a song called Road Beyond the View that's about that lust we have for the road that goes around the corner that you can't see where it is. That's the American lust. So that's why the album's called Road Beyond the View. And on the cover is a red 1951 Chevrolet. And on the back is a blue turquoise colored 1951 Chevrolet. And this is where you can find me, is through my music. And my music is all on my website. Very soon we're going to start a subscription series where you can take all the content that I've ever done, all the albums that I've ever made that I own, and I own most of them now. I own all my songs, and I've re-recorded some of those that I don't own from other record labels, and I put it all in this one subscription thing where all you gotta do is pay so much a month and you can stream it all.
Awesome.
You know, it's a way you can have access to it, or you can buy it on the website. I'm a trader in my heart, so I've made a living as a songwriter and a musician all my life. I've never held any other job. So I do have had some ranches and run some cattle. I have to admit it was a hobby more than it was a business, but I did okay on the business side of it. But other than being a kind of a cowboy as a second vocation, that's kind of a hobby calling, I can't believe I've made my living all my life as a balladeer in music. And what I love to sing about is the cowboy life, the West, the countryside of America, the farmers, the ranchers, the agriculturalists, the foresters. These are the people that are my heroes.
And nobody does it better. Michael, your songs, you capture it all. It's wonderful. Thank you for lending your perspective on the Santa Fe Trail. This has been fun.
Well, it's only my perspective. I do want to say none of this would have happened if it weren't for the Santa Fe Trail Association.
Yes.
And I want to mention, if you go on the Santa Fe Trail Association website, you can buy books that have all the information that I've mentioned in there. Also some DVDs that they sell, and you'll be supporting the organization that basically has rocked the whole 200th anniversary. I owe it all to Deb Goodrich, who I've been friends with for years. We're both diehard history buffs, mainly about the West. When she took over her position as the manager of the 200th anniversary for the Santa Fe Trail Association, that's when she asked me to be honorary chair. And the only way I got there was because I've done so much Western music. So I owe it all to the Santa Fe Trail Association. And I highly recommend anybody who's listening, who's been interested in any of this stuff I've said, if you want to catch up with all this, just go to Santa Fe Trail Association's website. You buy something from them, you join the association, you won't believe how much fun it is.
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And you are a fantastic storyteller. This has really, really been very informative and entertaining.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to another terrific episode of the Truckers Network radio show here on TNCRadio.live with Michael Martin Murphey. I'm Shelley Johnson. Stay tuned for more right here on TNCRadio.live. Thank you for listening to another great interview on TNCRadio.live and the Truckers Network radio show. All of the material you hear on TNCRadio.live on our website, our broadcasts, or our podcasts are copyrighted. There can be no distribution without the express consent of TNCRadio.live and its partners. For inquiries, write us at info@tncradio.live.